The 2007 Lebanon conflict began when fighting broke out between Fatah al-Islam, an Islamist militant organization, and the Lebanese armed forces on May 20, 2007 in Nah al-Bed, an UNRWA Palestinian refugee camp near Tripoli. It was the most severe internal fighting since Lebanon's 1975–90 civil war. The conflict revolved mostly around the siege of Nah al-Bed, but minor clashes also occurred in the Ain al-Hilway refugee camp in southern Lebanon, and several terrorist bombings took place in and around Lebanon's capital, Beirut. Fighting ended in September 2007. Background: Nah al-Bed refugee camp. Lebanon is home to more than 400,000 Palestinian refugees, some 215,000 of whom live in camps, including the descendants of those who fled from Palestine during the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. In 1962, Palestinians were categorized as foreigners in Lebanon, regardless of how long they had lived there. Non-Lebanese, which included the refugees, were restricted from working in over 70 skilled professions until 2005, when new legislation officially opened 50 such jobs to them. The civil war left Lebanon's government and the general Lebanese populace deeply suspicious of Palestinian refugees because of their involvement in the Lebanese War. Yet, under a 1969 Arab Accord, later annulled by the Lebanese parliament in the mid-1980s but maintained in principle, the government has been reluctant to enter the camps. The current residents of the camps are currently denied access to their homeland or neighboring Arab nations. The Nah al-Bed Palestinian refugee camp is situated 16 kilometers north of Tripoli near the coastal road and had been under scrutiny since February, when 2 buses were bombed in Ain Alik, a predominantly Christian village near Bikefera. Fatah al-Islam militants based in the camp were blamed. About 30,000 displaced Palestinians live in the camp. Timeline: May 20. Start of the fighting in Tripoli and Nah al-Bed. Fighting began early in the morning after a police raid on a house in Tripoli which was apparently being used by militants from Fatah al-Islam. The militant group subsequently began shooting at the Lebanese security forces who returned fire, triggering clashes in the vicinity of the Nah al-Bed Palestinian refugee camp near Tripoli. The men reportedly resisted arrest and the violence spread to neighboring streets. Militants then attacked a Lebanese military post at the gate of the camp, slaughtering 27 soldiers during their sleep, seizing several vehicles and also killing an undetermined number of civilians that came to the rescue of the Lebanese army. May 21–31. Nah al-Bed under siege despite talks of a ceasefire. Fatah al-Islam militants continued battling the Lebanese army at the outskirts of the refugee camp, while Lebanese tanks and artillery continued shelling their positions in the camp. By now the camp was totally surrounded by the Lebanese army and more troops were coming in with tanks and APCs. Beirut airport was the scene of several military aid shipments, mainly from the United States. June 1–2. First Lebanese army attacked tanks massed outside the Nah al-Bed camp and started a ground offensive. The fighting was concentrated in the southern and northern entrances of the camp. At least 19 people were killed, including 3 army soldiers. Among the dead was also a senior leader of Fatah al-Islam, Abu Riyad. He had been killed by a Lebanese army sniper. After 48 hours of fighting, the battle was over and the army was repelled. June 9–12. Second Lebanese army attack. After mediators failed to convince the Islamists to surrender, the Lebanese army attacked Nah al-Bed once again. The troops advanced 50 meters before they had to stop after taking heavy casualties due to booby-trapped buildings and other Fatah al-Islam positions that the militants left behind. In all, 29 people were killed within 24 hours. 11 soldiers, 16 militants and 2 civilians. Another 100 soldiers were wounded. Some of the fighting was close quarters and almost hand-to-hand. On June 11, 2 Lebanese Red Cross workers were killed outside Nahr al-Bared as they were evacuating civilians. On June 12, the Lebanese army continued their push and took 2 key positions from Fatah al-Islam within the camp, one of them on the coastal side of the camp. June 16 to 19. 3rd Lebanese Army attack. The Lebanese army continued the offensive and heavy bombardment hit the camp. On June 16, 2 Lebanese Gazelle helicopters fired 4 air-to-ground missiles at suspected militant positions inside the camp. In 48 hours the army managed to take another 6 Fatah al-Islam positions. At this time the only aim of the military was to destroy all of the militants' positions on the outskirts of the camp, but the army had no intention of going into the camp itself. On June 19, the army finally managed to take all of the main positions of the Islamists. All of the buildings in the new part of the camp where the Fatah al-Islam fighters were dug in had been taken. Another 7 soldiers were killed during this new round of fighting. June 21. Outer parts of the camp fall. On June 21, the Lebanese defense minister reported that all of the Fatah al-Islam positions on the outlying areas of the camp, from which the militants were attacking soldiers, had been taken or destroyed. The only positions left were those in the center of the camp from where the militants posed no threat and thus the army had no intention of attacking the center of the camp. With this it was declared that the Lebanese military operation to destroy Fatah al-Islam was over, but heavy fighting still continued in the days ahead. June 24-25, renewed fighting in Tripoli and Nahr al-Bared. On June 24, for the first time since May 20, fighting erupted in Tripoli at an apartment building after a military raid on an Islamist militant cell that left 12 people dead. Among the killed were 7 non-Fatah militants, 1 soldier, 1 policeman and 3 civilians. Another 14 soldiers were wounded. On June 28, the military found and engaged a group of Fatah al-Islam militants in a cave in the mountains south of Tripoli, in fighting that killed 5 Islamists. June 30. Jund al-Sham disbanded. On June 30, the Uzbat al-Ansar source said that 23 members of Jund al-Sham in the Ain al-Helwa camp on the outskirts of the port city of Sidon have joined up with Uzbat at a meeting, while the rest had laid down their weapons. Uzbat al-Ansar detained 3 other members of the group on suspicion of hurling a grenade at an army checkpoint, in an incident that caused no casualties. July 12 to 24. 4th Lebanese Army attack. On July 12, after a lull in the fighting, the Lebanese army launched a new assault towards the center of the camp where the last battle positions of the Islamists were. They resumed with the bombardment of the camp and troops engaged the militants in heavy street fighting. 33 soldiers were killed and 93 wounded during the fighting among the ruins of the camp where the Islamist fighters were well dug in, and large parts of the camp were also booby-trapped. On July 14, militants escalated the fighting by firing Katyusha rockets at towns surrounding the camp. 1 civilian was killed, and several were wounded. On July 16, the army managed to take a hill in the southern part of the camp which represented a highly strategic position. By July 20, only 300 square yards had been left in the hands of the Islamists in the southern part of the camp. The army's advance was slowed down until they were able to defuse dozens of booby traps left in the ruins of the camp by the Islamists. July 25 – August 13. 5th Lebanese Army attacks. Soldiers moved into the fighting area under cover from artillery fire, tank fire and gunfire. A witness said this was the heaviest shelling of insurgent positions he had ever seen. A Lebanese source said the army was ready to make the final push and capture the last 250 yards still in hands of the insurgents. About 130 people were believed to be holed up in the area, about 70 fighters and 60 civilians. The militants answered with the firing of a handful of Katyusha rockets at Lebanese villages near the camp. On July 28, a tiny enclave in the already recaptured part of the camp was captured and the militants inside, 8 people, were killed. The surprise attack was carried out by elite units. Cannons and armored vehicles were driven into the camp to demolish fortified houses, bunkers and tunnels. General Michel Suleiman added that victory was imminent and only days away. On August 2, Abu Huraira, the deputy commander of Fatah al-Islam, was killed in Abu Samra during a shootout with Lebanese police when he tried to flee them whilst shooting at a checkpoint set up by the police. On August 8, it was reported the advance of the Lebanese troops was troubled by the smell of rotting corpses of slain militants who are not buried, even weeks after their death. It was said the smell was so bad the air was unbreathable. August 17–23. 6th Lebanese Army attack. In the days leading up to the latest assault on the militants, Gazelle attack helicopters bombed the Islamists' positions and bunkers. On August 17, the army advances continued. A truce was made on August 24 to allow the 63 family members, 25 women and 38 children, of the Islamist fighters to leave the camp. This left a chance for a final assault on the militants by the army, and indications were that only 70 militants were left active in the camp. In reality, almost 100 were still holed up. Air raids continued the next day, August 30. September 3. Final Lebanese army attack. Heavy fighting continued on August 30 after the evacuation of the civilians and almost a week of heavy bombing raids from attack helicopters. More street battles occurred as the troops advanced further into the winding streets of the camp. By this point most of the subterranean shelters had been taken by the army, but still the militants held their positions in bunkers and among the ruins of the camp. All the time during the latest attack the militants were issuing calls for a ceasefire so that some 35 wounded militants could be evacuated. The army did not accept the ceasefire. On September 1, the army managed to take the homes of Sheikh al-Absa and his deputy Abu Huraira, who was killed in July during the fighting. However, there was still no sign of Absa himself. September 2. Militant breakout and the fall of the camp. On September 2, militants launched a coordinated plan to escape from Al-Bayt. The fighting began when militants on the eastern and southern edge of the camp attacked army checkpoints. Militants also had help from outside the camp. The attack on the eastern edge of the camp started after a Mercedes car pulled up at an army checkpoint from outside around 4 a.m. and began firing at soldiers as fighters launched an attack from inside the camp. At the same time, militants attacked another checkpoint on the southern edge of the camp. Some of them were wearing army uniforms. 3 militant groups attempted the breakout. One group tried to escape by sea and its members were killed or captured by the army. A second group tried to flee from the north of Al-Bayt and met the same fate. The leader of Fatah al-Islam, Sheikh al-Absa, was believed to be in the third group that followed the path of a river running between the southeastern part of the camp and the village of Ayn al-Samik in a remote mountainous region. Several members of that group were killed but most of them escaped. The whole militant leadership was thought to have escaped. It was later confirmed that al-Absa actually fled the camp a day before the breakout. His fate remains unknown. The army said 35 militants managed to break the cordon and flee, but most of them were killed or captured in the coming days. The fighting lasted from dawn through early afternoon, with troops engaging Fatah al-Islam fighters in buildings, fields and roads around the Al-Bayt camp. Up to 38 militants, 5 soldiers and 1 civilian were killed and 24 militants were captured. The camp finally fell by 11 a.m. Celebratory gunfire erupted in nearby villages as soon as the news of the army victory spread. Dozens of residents took to the streets of Muhammarah, waving Lebanese flags and honking their horns as troop convoys poured into the area with soldiers flashing victory signs. On September 3, Lebanese forces killed 4 militants and captured 2 in the area near the camp. The militants attacked soldiers looking for the fleeing fighters, wounding 2 of them and forcing the Lebanese soldiers to flee, but were finally killed by artillery fire which lasted for more than an hour. 6 bodies of slain militants were found inside the camp. Sporadic fighting continued near the camp until September 7. Lebanon then declared victory. Bombings in and around Beirut. May 21. Fatah al-Islam claimed responsibility for 2 bombings that took place in Beirut. Then a spokesman for the group denied any responsibility for them. A third bombing, in a Christian neighborhood northeast of Beirut called Mansouriya, was foiled when authorities caught a Palestinian and an Egyptian carrying a bag full of explosives. May 23. A bomb went off near the main government building in Ali, a majority Druze town about 17 kilometers northeast of Beirut. Reports said about 5 people were injured and a few buildings damaged by the blast. The security forces said the bomb was in a bag that had been left in front of a building close to a shopping district. May 27. In Beirut, 2 policemen and 2 civilians were injured when a grenade was thrown in a mainly Muslim section of the city. June 13. A car bomb hit Beirut's seafront Corniche Almanara, killing Walid Edo, a member of parliament with the Current for the Future bloc known for his opposition to the Syrian influence on Lebanon. His eldest son, Khalid, and 2 bodyguards were also killed, along with up to 6 other civilians. The blast may have been tied to the fighting in the north, or it may have been tied to the series of bombings and assassinations of anti-Syrian figures going back to Rafiq Hariri's killing. Attacks on United Nations peacekeepers. On June 24, a UNIFIL armored personnel carrier was hit by a car bomb on the border with Israel, killing 6 Spanish soldiers and wounding another 2 Spanish soldiers. Both the Lebanese government and Hezbollah condemned the attack. Intelligence gathered from captured militants indicated that the militants were planning to attack United Nations soldiers on the Israeli-Lebanese border. Also, Fatah al-Islam itself said that if the fighting continued it would conduct attacks on targets outside of northern Lebanon. Al-Qaeda also stated that it would target the UN troops on the border. Casualties. At least 446 people, including 168 soldiers and 226 militants, had been killed in the fighting during the 105-day siege of the camp. Between 400 and 500 soldiers had been wounded and more than 215 militants had been captured. 12 Lebanese civilians were killed in terrorist bombings in and around Beirut. 2 soldiers and 5 militants were killed in the Ain al-Hilway camp. 7 non-Fatah Islamic militants were killed during a raid in Tripoli, and 6 UN soldiers were killed, while 2 were wounded in the bombing attack on the Israeli-Lebanon border. 54 civilians were killed in the fighting at the camp and in Tripoli, 47 of them Palestinians. Most of the some 31,000 Palestinians that lived at the camp fled the fighting to other camps in the country.